Morning, everybody. So for this module, we're going to be looking, it's kind of a mini module because of Thanksgiving next week. We're going to be looking at some research papers and getting started on the final project. The actual kind of more content, sugar and sweetener stuff is going to be, we're going to wait on that until the next time, just because we only really have time for one of these sessions. And I want to make sure you have enough time to start your final project. So the up to this point, when we've talked about articles and papers and things like that, we've mostly been talking about magazine type things, where you'd get something that was designed for a general audience, for a non-scientific audience. And so now that we've had a little practice with that, we're going to transition into more of a scientific type papers and research articles, and what those look like and how to find them, and then how we're going to use them for the final project. All right, so if you look over on Blackboard here, I think I have it. There are a list of papers, and we're going to get more into these in the next, after Thanksgiving. For now, I'm just going to use one as an example. If you want to look through them, read through them, that's fine. I will warn you, they're not all great. These papers are a mix of decent research and pretty bad research. So when we start talking about how to criticize research, that's why we have some examples that maybe aren't so great. The one thing you do have to do this week is to propose your final project. And the reason that I want you to do that now is to make sure that you're not trying to get this done at the very last second, because the process of finding the research papers that you need and the papers that you need for the project can be kind of time consuming and can take a while. So it's not something you can really do last minute at all. Okay, so let's take a look at a research paper and what we mean when we say research paper. So here's one. This is a not great paper, and we'll talk a little bit about why, from the notoriously difficult and often poorly done field of nutrition research and weight loss research. So how do you identify a scientific paper from a more, a popular type paper? And so some of the keys are one, in its format. So a research paper will generally be titled based on what is being studied, and it will usually be fairly specific. It won't just be like, it won't have attention grabbing things like check this out, or look what we found, or whatever. It'll just be very straight ahead and dry. There are usually going to be several authors, because in a scientific paper, unlike even scholarly papers in other fields, authorship doesn't necessarily mean that you wrote anything for the paper. Often the people listed as authors are the researchers, the people who did the work. They might be professors, they might be researchers in industry, they might be postdoctoral researchers, graduate students, undergraduate research students. Anybody who had a hand in doing the work often gets their name on here, and so that's why they have these big author lists usually. And generally they will also list their affiliation with little numbers. So if we look down at the footnotes there, it'll tell you where those people are and what they're doing. So here, you have a university center, and then at University of Colorado, and then there's somebody else is from Temple University, so it's collaborative study. Then often the very first author and the very last author are particularly important. Usually the very first author is the one who actually did most of the writing and kind of led the real work in the study. The very last author is usually like a primary investigator, or somebody who kind of oversaw the whole thing, maybe a professor or somebody who runs the lab that this whole thing is being done in. And sometimes papers, this one maybe does it at the very end. It doesn't look like it. Sometimes sometimes they will specifically list what each author did as a part of the study. So they'll say, and this person collected data, this person and this person prepared manuscript, whatever. All right, so you got a bunch of list of authors. You will generally also then see an abstract. It's not listed as such here, but this is called an abstract. An abstract is a summary of the whole article. In some cases, like in this one, it is split up into different sections: objective, methods, results, and conclusions. In other papers, it's just a paragraph that summarizes the paper. Abstracts are nice because they give you a quick reference to the whole paper, a quick summary. They're almost always freely available, whereas the actual full papers are sometimes behind a paywall for a commercial subscription type journal. So it's usually easy to access the abstracts. Now, there's also a danger with that a lot of people, when they're doing their research online, only read the abstracts. And that's a problem because even though the abstract is a summary, there's no real check that it's a good or reasonable or appropriate summary. It often has a little bit of salesmanship involved. So sometimes the abstract can oversell the results a little bit. A lot of the subtlety in scientific research where, yeah, we found this, but here are the issues that maybe don't fit with what we found, all those kind of nice little things, those little criticisms, those little things that you need to think about when we think about the scientific method are not in the abstract. The abstract is often very clear, and so we have to be a little bit careful. So that's why it is not okay to only get your information from the abstract. But it can be a good starting point. All right. So then papers are almost always published in this format. If we just kind of browse through it, they're usually in a 2-column format with a pretty small font with lots of tables and figures interwoven in there. They're often broken up into sections. This one is introduction, methods, results, discussion, and I guess that's it. Sometimes there's a conclusion also at the end. And then references, acknowledgments, references. So scientific work is always based on other scientific work that came before it. So any good study should have a long list of references at the end that are referred to in the paper from all the work that came before that they are using to build on this study. So you'll see, in the paper itself, there are, zoom in here, there are some numbers that give you some different references that so when you assert a fact in a paper like this, you have to have supporting data, just like when you write a research paper for a class. So, like, for example, despite the long history of usage, there continues to be considerable controversy concerning their role in the diet, particularly whether they are a useful tool and an aid in weight loss and weight loss maintenance 3 through 6. So here are 4 different papers that all speak to that couple sentences. Ideally anyway. Sometimes there's a little nonsense going on in there with people citing their own work so that they get better numbers of how many times their papers have been cited. But ideally, those speak to that. All right, so you've got this paper that kind of looks like this. It should be relatively easy to pick out this kind of a look. So let's look back on Blackboard and see some of these other papers. They're all from different journals. I wanted to get a variety of ones that look different, so that you can kind of see what some of the variety is. So here, once again, you can kind of see that format again. You can see that you've got your abstract here separate. You've got separated into those sections: introduction, methods, results, blah, blah, blah. Lots of references, hopefully at the end. Yeah. Another one here. And go ahead and kind of look through these. Right, so in this case, again, you've got lots of abstracts. You've got lots of authors. You've got the abstract here in the middle. This particular abstract is not split into sections, but then the paper is, again, starting with an introduction, methods, results, and then the references at the end. Lots of references on this. This is a review paper, so it collects lots of research from other studies. So, 205 references on this one. Okay, so that's the idea. All right. So how do you read a paper like this? This is kind of the next challenge, because there's a couple reasons why reading a paper like this can be challenging. One is that it's not written for us being people who are not researchers in this particular field. These papers are written for other researchers who are doing this work to report the results. So they often use a lot of jargon, that is language that is specific to that field that people outside of that field might not know at all. So words and phrases and abbreviations and things that we don't, know. And then they often can be really dense. So there's a lot of information in there. You saw how big the papers are. That can be really complicated and difficult as well. And then, sorry, I'm looking for one more thing here. Okay. Anyway, so when we read a paper like this, we want to know the results, we want to know the paper, but it's often not practical to read it straight from front to back, particularly if you're not used to this kind of language, you're not used to reading these types of papers. If you just sat down from word one and tried to read the whole entire thing in order, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. It would be actually hard to get through, even for a pretty good reader. It would be, it just wouldn't make a lot of sense. So we need some strategy in working through these types of papers. And for your final project, ultimately, you will want to read the whole paper, but there's a lot of preparation work we can do to make sure that that reading is successful and not just a waste of time. So we want to always start with the abstract because it is that summary. We're going to keep in our brain that the abstract may not be totally great and it may not tell us everything we need to know, but it'll give us a place to start. It'll give us some definitions, so they use this NNS abbreviation throughout this particular paper, and there it is defined right at the first sentence of the abstract. So if we don't know what that is, non-nutritive sweetened beverages, that's something that we could then look up and try to figure out what it is that they're talking about as a non-nutritive sweetened beverage. And then the other thing we want to do when we go through the paper is it can be helpful to read the introduction, but the introduction often doesn't have a whole lot to do with this particular study. The introduction is really describing past work. So it's not really an introduction to this study so much as it is introducing you to the whole field, to what has come before, to what people have done, and where are the gaps? Why is this research that's being done in this paper necessary? What hasn't been done yet? And so that can be interesting, but it often doesn't have a whole lot to do with specifically this thing that we're trying to figure out. So we can sometimes just skip over it at first. Sometimes it's helpful, but we can sometimes skip over it because maybe we don't really care so much about what happened in the past. The second part is going to be the methods, and this is the specific details of how the study worked, like what did they actually do. And while that can be really useful, especially when you're trying to figure out is this a good or a bad, or what are the good things or problems with the study, it can be useful to know how many people were in each group and what were their ages and their characteristics. Is this a good sample of humanity, or is this skewed in one direction or the other? That's all really helpful. But when you're trying to just understand what's happening in this whole thing, we can save that for later. We don't need to wade through the details of exactly how many people there were and what they did every day and what the specific study was yet. We might want to know that eventually, but we don't need to know that right away. Where I like to start after reading the abstract is looking at the results and discussion. So the results should be just a straight ahead reporting of what the findings were. And the discussion should be the author's attempt to make meaning out of those results. What do those things mean? What do they tell us? What do they not tell us? So that's where I like to spend most of the time in a paper like this. I use the title and the abstract to figure out what's the general idea, what are they studying, and how did it go? And then the results in this discussion to really get the results and what they found. Usually, I don't know if this one has it. So this one doesn't have a whole lot of figures, it just kind of has one here, and it's just a bar graph. It's not great. But often the results are where you'll find the most useful figures. Journal page space is at a premium, even though things are mostly digital now. It's still at a premium. So if you're going to take up space with a picture or a graph of some sort, it's probably going to be the most important information of the paper. Maybe not always, but in many papers, looking for graphs and trying to make sense of those graphs is a good way to start figuring out what's going on. Because they wouldn't take the time to make a nice figure and present it with all and take up all the space that a figure takes up if it didn't really if it wasn't really important to understanding what happened. All right, so the results here you can see. We zoom in here. They talk about what happened, how many people began, how many people stopped, what were the differences. And then they're talking about weight loss in this paper. So they're talking about some of the main differences. After 12 weeks in treatment, blah, blah, blah. So, they're going through the results there. And so the key result here, which is another reason I think this paper is kind of interesting, is they do all this stuff, and after 12 weeks of treatment, these changes were not significantly different between treatment groups. So, they're, it's unusual that studies get published when they don't find an effect, and in this case, they really didn't find much of an effect. And I think the results in the abstract show this as well. So the two treatments were not equivalent to this treatment group losing significantly more weight compared to the water group. So, it didn't have an effect. And I think it's important sometimes to report those negative results as well. And so the discussion in this paper is kind of interesting because they undertook this study thinking that they were, they're weight loss researchers. So they're trying to figure out, does this or this affect weight loss? And so they're saying here that this really doesn't. One thing that is a little bit suspect here so moving into criticism now a little bit. Often in these studies, especially in nutrition, they're all over the place. When they don't find an effect, they kind of dig around the data until they can find an effect, and then they report that. And that's not always ethical to do so. So in this case, they do see a significant difference in the percent of participants who achieved at least 5% weight loss, which is a pretty specific way of playing with the data to make a difference shown. And then they have that in their big picture here. So that's sometimes an issue with these papers. So when you are looking through these and you're not a researcher and you're not really qualified to weigh in on whether or not this is great, what do you do? How do you find out if this is good research or not? Well, one thing you can do is you can look at the citations, the other researchers that have used this paper. So if we go back to Blackboard here, there's a great tool called Google Scholar. Looks like regular Google, but it says Scholar. And we can look up the paper in this, and we can just kind of get the title or the authors. Oh, let me show you this too. If it's hard to find that stuff, most modern papers now are equipped with a document identifier. You can see right here, DOI, right there. So if we select that document identifier, that's unique to each paper. So that can often be a way to find it. So I can paste that in. Whoops, I didn't get it copied properly. Hold on. Try that again. There we go. That should bring up that paper right here. And so you can see it here. That's our paper. And here's where we find more information about it. So this is an older paper from 2014. And one thing that is maybe the most helpful thing about Google Scholar is the citation tree here. So we can actually, this link right here, cited by 127, that tells us that 127 other researchers, or there were 127 other papers that reference this paper as background information. So just by clicking on that link, we can now see a list of all the papers that referenced that. And so that allows us to find things like a meta-analyses where they take lots of studies and put them all together. It allows us to find more modern versions of this. So if I want to go to years, let's say I only want to look at papers from this year that cited that paper. I can now have just papers from 2021, so we can get a little bit of a sense of, is this paper still relevant now, 7 years later, or not? And so we could look and read some of these papers and try to figure that out. So those are all ways of understanding and trying to figure out what's going on with a paper. So now let's look at the final project and how you're going to do this. So the final project, the instructions are given here in Blackboard, as well as a whole bunch of good papers from former students. So you can get some good, I know it's always nice to see, like, what does a good paper look like? What are the expectations? And so you can see those. So what we want to do is, oftentimes with scientific research, it is poorly communicated. So some research groups publish a paper, they do some good research. The papers are often written in the type of careful scientific language to not try to make giant claims and to be really careful about, like, we found this, we did not find this. We found this connection, that does not mean this and this and this. And then when that gets translated out into popular media, a lot of that subtlety is often lost. And so you have this, you have like a sensational article that's published in a newspaper that says, scientists find a link between this and this. And it's like the new big thing. And then they say, you shouldn't drink coffee anymore or something. And so oftentimes there's some mistakes in that translation. And that's what we're going to investigate here. So rather than look specifically for a scientific paper to write about, in this project, you're going to first look at a non-scientific paper, an article from a newspaper, magazine, or blog. So these are the same types of sources that you would have used for your article reports earlier in the semester. But this time, we want to find ones that cite at least two, I can't reach that far, I'll use my, that cites at least two scientific research papers. So you've got a newspaper type article that cites at least two scientific research papers. And then you're going to write about all of that stuff and investigate the connection between the research papers and the article itself. So let's pull up one of these example papers from a student. I'm not going to read the paper, you can do that, but I am going to grab their references so we can look at their how they found their stuff. This is another nutrition one, just coincidentally. You don't have to do anything on nutrition. There's any kind of topic is fine here. You could do climate change, you could do chemistry, pharmaceuticals, COVID-19, you could do and other environmental stuff, you could do biology, you could do anything where somebody is publishing scientific papers and then the media is writing about those papers. So here, this person, wow, I didn't do this on purpose, but this happens to be the exact same topic that we have our example papers on. I encourage you to pick a different one if this is not something that really interests you. But and please don't use the direct ones from the example papers. Use your own papers. So in this case, here is this is a non-scientific paper, right? This is just a general knowledge web page from the Harvard School of Public Health that is meant for, average everyday people to learn about low-calorie sweeteners. And so, they write some stuff about them. But the key to this is, even though it's just a general, it's meant for general knowledge, they cite specific research that supports what they're saying. So they have references here. There's reference number 3. Here's reference number 4. And if we go down to the bottom to actually see their references, maybe. Where are the references? Oh, here they are. They're hidden in a little thing here. Okay, so then here are all the references. These are scientific papers that they have cited. We do have to be a little bit careful if you find these. So let's say you're using this article and you're going through these and you found a couple you want. Some of the references here are not scientific studies. So for example, the very first one is a reference sheet with information from the FDA. That's fine. It's not saying it's bad information, but that is not, if we click on it, we can see that is not a, once it loads here, it's not a scientific paper. It doesn't have all the authors. It's not talking about the methods and the stuff. It's just a data sheet about what are these different sweeteners. So not a study. These other ones look like they probably are. There's a dental one, clinical nutrition, sports medicine, so in many cases, you'll be able to get the paper that you want by just clicking directly to it, but sometimes not. So let's take a look at this one. Okay, so I click on the link, and this one seems like more of a scientific paper. It's got that all the authors and stuff, and review, it's all here. The other thing that's nice here is you can see that it is free access rather than being behind a paywall. So this is an article that you can just access and you're good to go. I'm just curious if we can find one that we can't access. There has been a big push recently to make more and more research freely available to the public, which is great. So often don't have to worry so much about getting papers from behind paywalls from the library as we did in the past. Now that said, if you run into a paper that is telling you that you have to buy it, don't buy it. You don't need to buy it. The library will be able to get this for you, and we'll talk about how that works. So if I click on the PDF, that will give us the nice formatted copy here. Let's see what happens. Okay, so this is another free one. That's great, and we get the PDF for sure. But let's say we didn't get it. What do? Well, you go to the library. Harper's Library has access to many journals, and if they don't have access to them, they can get them for you for free through a service called Interlibrary Loan. So if we're on Harper's webpage here, go to the library. And so you could search in the OneSearch or in the catalog for that journal name and see if the library has it. And if they don't, you can go to Interlibrary Loan here under Services, and you can request the article. The way that works is you fill out a form. The library will get the article from a different library. They will scan it in, or the other library will scan it, and they will send you the PDF. So it usually takes a few days or so to get that processed, unless it's some really obscure thing where it's an actual physical book that's in a warehouse somewhere and somebody has to go dig it out and scan it, that can take a little bit longer, but generally it's going to take a few days. So that's why I want to make sure that you're getting started now and getting your papers together. So the assignment for this week is not the final project. That's not due till the end of class. It's this proposal. So for this module, what you need to do is pick your papers. So make sure you have your article. We're gonna call. It's confusing to talk about these things because everything can be called articles. But when we say article, we're going to talk about the news article that comes from a news source that is not a scientific paper. And then for the other ones, we're going to call them research papers or scientific papers. So you want to have your article and your research papers that are linked from that article or referenced from that article. And then just a quick summary of each research paper. Right? So just so I know that you kind of look through it and have a basic idea of what it is and that it's something that you're interested in. Then I will look at all those and I will let you know if there's a problem. So if you didn't understand the assignment, if you didn't pick the right types of papers that don't connect properly. But if you read the instructions, if you watch this video, if you look at all of the former student examples and how they did it, I think you'll be able to find the right kind of thing. And of course, you can always ask me if you have any questions. You can send me a link on Discord and say, hey, does this look okay? And I'll check it out and get right back to you. Anyway, so then after next week, you have the whole rest of the semester, the last 2 weeks to actually write and complete the paper. So let me know if you have any questions on that. And I will not be back online here next week, but the week after, we'll do that again. And Group A will be back in lab next week for the final experiment. All right, thanks, everybody. Talk to you later. Have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.